As the title suggests, I'll be presenting on a topic which I'm labelling networked legitimacy conflicts, and I hope to obviously elucidate that in the course of my remarks. I should preface those really by saying a little bit more about my centre, with your leave. The Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Sydney has the tasks of a normal standard academic unit, the teaching and the research, etc. But it also has a proud tradition of public advocacy and outreach to organisations beyond the academic community in the championing of what we call peace with justice. And in the course of those activities, we work quite closely with groups in Sydney and also connected with those beyond that immediate milieu who try to highlight issues of human rights, issues of people in struggle for their rights and freedoms. And two of the groups with whom we have worked and with whom we have partnered over recent years have been people in Australia who have been putting forward the rights of the Tamil people of Sri Lanka and people who have been putting forward the rights and freedoms and the aspirations to self-determination of the Palestinians. And indeed, because my centre has this advocacy remit enshrined in its constitution, we do, from time to time, take positions on policy positions, not policy positions, I hasten to add, that take sides in a conflict or that attempt to cheer on one party to prevail over another, but rather, again, in furtherance of this notion of peace with justice. So, for example, we were early advocates of the call for an independent international investigation by the United Nations of the very serious war crimes allegations hanging over the Sri Lankan government as a legacy of its military victory over the Tamil Tigers 5 years ago, and I'll say some more about that in my presentation. We are also advocates of, or we respond to the call by Palestinian civil society for boycott, divestment and sanctions by being advocates of the academic boycott of Israel. And we work with other groups in the Australian community which have similar interests and similar outlook, including an interesting group that I'll say a little bit more about called the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network. Now, the context within which these groups operate in Australia is a little bit different from that in the UK, in the sense that the centre of gravity of opinion on these issues is, you could say, far over to one side. There's a very strong influence in Australian politics of pro-Israel groups, for example, in pronouncements by ministers in the current Australian government. The Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, went to attend the funeral for Ariel Sharon at the beginning of this year. She was being interviewed by an Israeli journalist, and she demanded to know of this journalist, well, what is it, what bit of international law is it that makes these settlements illegal anyway, she said. So happily the journalist was able to enlighten her. On a separate occasion, the Attorney General in the Australian government, George Brandis, was happy to pronounce that East Jerusalem should not henceforth be referred to as occupied territory. So, you know, we'll leave him alone with that one and a cup of Horlicks for a couple of hours. But in a separate development, the stock in trade of the present Australian government is very much its tough approach to asylum seekers, in particular people who have arrived by boat arrivals they're called. I was reminded of it earlier in the remarks by Lara this morning about the grievability of bodies, the grievability of particular political subjects, and that may very well be connected with their visibility in the public sphere. And the Australian government goes to great lengths to exclude from any form of symbolic domain any speech or appearance in their own right by asylum seekers, which you might think is closely connected with that policy. And the policy has also led Australia to declare, and the Prime Minister Tony Abbott has made this declaration, that Sri Lanka should be seen as a country at peace, that there's no war in Sri Lanka and therefore there's no legitimate reason why people should seek asylum from Sri Lanka by heading in boats to Australia, you see. So you could say that the centre of gravity of political discourse about the two conflicts that I'm going to be talking about in Australia is rather singular It's rather different, certainly, from the equivalent centre of gravity in this country. And that obviously is a context within which I and my centre have been engaging in this kind of public advocacy work. So that is by way of preamble to my remarks. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be suggesting that over recent years, the two conflicts in question, the conflicts over the claims to self-determination by the Tamils in Sri Lanka and the Palestinians respectively, have been changing. They have adopted changed forms. The conduct of those conflicts has been changing, and I am interested in trying to find out how and to what extent the change in forms, the passage of forms, if you like, is also affecting the content of those conflicts. And I'm going to be picking up on what I think are some interesting indications about that. And I should stress I'm really very near the beginning of this research. I'm very grateful to the fellowship here for enabling me to pursue it further. I've been developing another couple of lobes, if you like, of my theoretical and proposed methodological approach to delve deeper into this topic, and I'm trying it on an audience for the first time, so I'll crave your indulgence. But to go back a few years, the two struggles or the two conflicts we're talking about, the turning point really in many ways has been a notable military defeat for these two parties to the conflicts, the Tamil Tigers and the Palestinians. The upper picture shows, as you can see, a mural in the northern part of Sri Lanka, defaced with Sinhalese graffiti, and in front of it, the chap standing there in front of it is actually a Sri Lankan government soldier, because it was a photograph taken after the military defeat of the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam by the Sri Lankan military in 2009. That particular military initiative, as you will know, has remained highly controversial ever since. In particular because of the estimates that fly around, including from the United Nations, and also this one I've quoted here from Human Rights Watch, of the high civilian death toll. And the rationale always put forward by the Sri Lankan military was that concentrations of Tamil population were actually hiding Tamil Tiger fighters, and they would hide among the civilian population. Now, just as a side note, it's quite interesting, international humanitarian law, we think of the Geneva Conventions, adopted in 1948 after the Second World War in their present incarnation. The Fourth Geneva Convention governs the clear distinction that needs to be drawn between combatants and bystanders in combat. And of course, warfare is never static, it always evolves. One significant phase of its evolution was the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was notable in posing enemies against each other with an enormous technological disparity or asymmetry. And therefore there was a high incentive for the Vietnamese in that case not in fact to kind of enter the boxing ring and go toe-to-toe with their adversary, but instead to melt out of the civilian population, as it were, fire their pop guns and then melt back in again. And we all know what the American response to that was basically bomb the bastards. That in the memorable words of one of those American commanders that was caught on camera at the time, we're destroying this village in order to save it, because it was to redeem the local population from the mortal sin of harbouring these communist agitators in their midst. And now lots of people in the international community felt that to be unsatisfactory at the time, and sure enough the International Committee of the Red Cross reconvened in the late 70s after the Vietnam War and came up with two further rounds of additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions. And those additional protocols, in particular the second one that I'm talking about, it added another article, Article 50, to the Fourth Geneva Convention. One paragraph of that article says that the presence within a civilian population of non-civilians does not deprive that population of its civilian character. Doesn't deprive that population of its civilian character. And that principle was signed up to by over 160 countries That is about 80% of the international community. Of the other 20%, it includes Israel, Sri Lanka, and the United States. And I've always thought that could be connected with the fact that concerns over the inadequate discrimination in military action between targeting combatants and civilian bystanders, those concerns have focused on the actions of a number of countries, including, not confined to, but including those three countries. And maybe the disquieting statistics presented to us by the speaker from Reprieve in the previous session may also be connected with that. So that's just an interesting side note. So these reports were flying around about the number of civilians killed. One of the diplomatic cables disclosed by WikiLeaks was about a meeting held in Colombo some weeks before the end of those particular hostilities in Sri Lanka with the American ambassador and a group of other influential overseas ambassadors. And President Rajapakse himself came in. And he said, according to this note, he said to the American ambassador, well, you know, I'm sure you probably have better intelligence than me. Why don't you tell me what's going on? So the American ambassador had been anticipating this question, happened to have with him a sheaf of photographs from American geostationary assets, and was able to show that here is photograph one, Mr. President, of an area that's been bombed. That was on this date. On the subsequent date, the following day, you yourself declared that area to be a safe haven for civilians. So it's rather difficult then to explain this next picture, which shows the same area bombed again on the following day. And the note concludes with the observation by the Americans that we, that is to say we, the Americans, we have no control over what President Rajapakse will do, but we have now equipped him with the information he would need to take decisive action to put a stop to this bombing of civilian areas. So the test will now be whether he actually does anything. And of course the record established by the three-person UN fact-finding mission deployed by Ban Ki-moon shows that those civilian safe areas, despite being declared as such by the Sri Lankan government, continued to be bombed and shelled after that meeting. So one could see that as prima facie evidence to support a possible prosecution for war crimes, up to and including President Rajapakse himself on the grounds of command responsibility. So that is a very significant, I think, background factor. Might go some way to explaining the most recent changes to the Sri Lankan constitution, which further fortify the sovereign immunity of the president and have removed the maximum of 2 consecutive terms of office, meaning that President Rajapakse, so long as he continues to enjoy the success at the ballot box, could remain in office indefinitely. So that's some interesting background. The equivalent in some ways for the Palestinians, that the Palestinian case is more occluded. There's not a kind of a drop off a cliff in terms of military engagement. But certainly one significant turning point came in mid-2003. I recorded an interview at the time in my former guise as a television reporter with a pollster based in Bethlehem called Nabil Kukuli. And Mr. Kukuli had found the results of a tracking poll he'd been doing over the previous few months that the support for the Al-Aqsa Intifada among Palestinians had been dropping, and at that point in mid-2003 it lost majority public support. In other words, the initial strong support for it had turned around by that stage, that more Palestinians opposed its continuation than supported it. So that, in a sense, was a distant equivalent, if you like, of a military setback. And of course, what's been going on since then is ongoing Israeli colonization of Palestinian territory. The following year, 2004, saw the verdict by the World Court, the International Court of Justice, advisory opinion on the illegality of Israel's so-called separation barrier. Because it was an advisory opinion, the onus, it was felt, was on other actors, other state actors, other governments, to take action, such as, for example, action to prevent companies headquartered in their territory from continuing to cooperate with the construction of the wall. But because basically nobody did anything, that was really what supplied the impetus behind the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment and sanctions. In other words, the notion that the onus to respond to that verdict, if not taken up by states, therefore should pass on to civil society for people to respond to that call in their own context. So that, that could be the equivalent there. So if not by direct military means, how are these struggles, how are these conflicts to be waged? How are they now being waged? Of course, the answer is multifarious, by many simultaneous strategies, by many different actors in many different contexts. But I have been, I suppose, proceeding with a heuristic that I can conceptualize this transition that's now underway by reference to the concept of the communications scholar Manuel Castells, who in an essay, and hence my use of the word network, in an essay published, or an article published quite a while ago now, about 6 years ago now, it was called Power and Counterpower in the Network Society, very much the precursor to Castells' more recent work, communication power, and also about what he calls networked social movements. And networked social movements as political actors, I think, may be a concept that may reward, I hope it will reward, further attention in the context that I'm developing. So therefore, in this article, Castells posits that there has been a migration of the significant public sphere from what he calls the institutional realm to a communication space. And so he says media are the space of power making. And he clarifies he's not talking about the remarks that one sometimes hears with some justification about the power without responsibility wielded by media owners. The name Rupert Murdoch sometimes crops up in this regard. I can't think why. It's a different concept. It's not about necessarily the power of the media. He's saying that in this instance, he's saying that the media are the space where power is decided. And you can see that. I mean, people have connected this, for example, with the fortunes of the anti-war movement here in Britain. How often have we heard disgruntled anti-war activists saying, oh, we turned out, we got so many people to Hyde Park in mid-February 2003, but we couldn't stop that war. We couldn't stop that war, they say. And yeah, sure, that's an understandable lament on their part. Fast forward a few years, though, and here is David Cameron rising to his feet in the House of Commons in August 2013 to get approval from MPs for the use of force in Syria. A mandate which has never been denied, or had never been denied to a British head of government since 1782. And quite interesting the way it turned out, that not only did the Commons deprive Cameron of that mandate, but also, in a sense, both he and the leading protagonist on the other side of the argument, Ed Miliband, ended up espousing positions that they almost certainly never expected to at the outset of that debate. It was rather curious in many ways, as people have pointed out, that Cameron inferred from the proceedings, he said, we get it, you know, the British don't want us to involve ourselves in wars in the Middle East anymore, we get it. Which was rather odd, because that wasn't really on the table. Ed Miliband said, well, what we do know now is that we must have the evidence of a link between the Assad regime and complicity in this chemical weapons attack before we contemplate military action. So it was a reversal of the infamous MI6 memo from the invasion of Iraq, that the facts and the evidence were being fixed around the policy. Now Ed Miliband was saying the policy must be fixed around the facts and the evidence, which was interesting. But in a sense, the interesting thing about it for our purposes, for the purposes of this discussion, is the feeling that in many ways the significant acts in that debate, the significant iterations of meaning in that debate, had all taken place before Cameron rose to his feet in the House of Commons. That there had been a period of intense media activity, not only mainstream media but also social media, Lots of MPs referring to the large amount of Twitter traffic that they were getting from their constituents in the period leading up to that debate. And in Cameron's words, it raked over the experience that Britain had had in involvement in the invasion of Iraq, and that had poisoned the well of public opinion. Poisoned the well of public opinion. That public opinion had fed through by a number of means into political opinion, and that had fed through into the debate itself. So in a sense, you can see that as an example of what Castells is talking about, the migration of the significant ideational parts of the public sphere from an institutional realm to a communication space. And he says here that therefore, if that is so, then any political intervention, if it's going to be effective, requires presence in the media space. The rise of insurgent politics cannot be separated from the emergence of a new kind of media space, the space created around the process of mass self-communication. Not merely mass communication, but mass self-communication. So therefore, here is, in the upper picture here, video from Journalists for Democracy in Sri Lanka. Now, it's a screen grab from Channel 4 News, but it's originally a mobile phone video. So that's self-communication, yeah? The camera crew at the back there have the technology, we have the technology, to produce a broadcast quality recording. But they're not the only ones, not anymore. There's a world of what my former BBC colleague Nick Gowan calls information doers. So therefore, assumptions that people might make, or certainly the parties to conflict sometimes make, that a particular act, a particular atrocity perhaps, is taking place away from the prying gaze of the cameras, that assumption may now be automatically ill-founded, because there is such a proliferation of these information doers equipped with the technology to make those recordings. And that really has been the bedrock of the very important pioneering coverage offered by Channel 4 television of the end of that civil war in Sri Lanka and the well-attested evidence of abuses caught up in it. The lower picture shows Palestinian activists, and where we're all used to perhaps images of Palestinian activists carrying out the demonstration at Bil-Een in the shadow of the wall, demanding its dismantlement. This is a rather less familiar image of Palestinian activists, but they are obviously online using Facebook and such like. So that could be an example of this switch of tactics to wage the campaigns for their rights, their freedoms, their self-determination by means of entry into symbolic domains in this communication space. So what, therefore, I am suggesting is going on is a passage of forms, to use the Foucauldian term. It's a change in the conduct of these conflicts, a change in the conduct of these struggles. And what I'm interested in is to try to conceive of ways in which the influence of that change can be read back in the nature and content of those struggles and those conflicts. Is the change in conduct catalysing or bringing about a change in content as well? Now, there's some reason to suppose the answer is yes. The Tamil struggle is a struggle for self-determination, rights and freedoms. And they are therefore in company with many, many others around the world. One account has it that there are 200-odd states represented at the UN. Those 200-odd states contain between them at least 2,000 self-declared nations. So there's a ready-made state-nation dialectic, and there are people all over the world with claims to self-determination. The Tamils may have quite a strong one. There's an opinion from the International Commission of Jurists that when Sri Lanka revoked its post-independence constitution in 1978, it enlivened the Tamils' claim to self-determination as a nation. But I'm telling you this, and you're probably sitting there thinking, well, you know, so what? You know, there are gazillions of people around the world who could say the same thing. And it doesn't necessarily lend itself to making an impact in these symbolic domains. It doesn't necessarily propel the issue very far up the agenda in this communication space that I'm talking about. I would suggest that the majority of the symbolic political agency that has been waged in, by and on behalf of the Tamil struggle since the defeat of the Tamil Tigers has concentrated on legitimacy issues, with the top of the list the war crimes allegations against a serving head of state, President Rajapakse, which I've mentioned. And I suggest that's partly because of the nature of these symbolic domains. If we're talking about mainstream media, one of the most influential essays about journalism is still the 50-year-old Gautam Ruga essay, The Structure of Foreign News, which proposed a number of filters, or as they put it, tuning factors, which determine structural influences or describe structural influences over the contents of news. And they arise out of the organisation of news industries. One of the obvious ones is frequency. Mainstream media journalism favours developments in a conflict which have a discernible beginning, middle and end in the interval between deadlines. In the example given in the essay, a soldier is fired at, falls and dies on a battlefield. Beginning, middle, end. So it's all happened. So it gives rise to a narrative dominated by events at the expense of process. Another one is threshold, and threshold is very much in the eye of the beholder. The bomb that goes off in Kabul will attract now in the UK media very few column inches. Same bomb goes off in Bristol, heaven forfend, and it would quite rightly be all over the front pages. So threshold is relative. But certainly, if I told you that a serving head of state could be up on war crimes charges at The Hague, that's actually quite unusual. That's a pretty high threshold. There's only been one up to now, President Bashir of Sudan. Quite a long time ago, probably many people have forgotten about that, but that's quite rare, and therefore in mainstream media terms it satisfies the threshold criterion put forward by Gautam and Ruga. In social media or digital media terms, it might be clickbait for some people. Head of state on war crime charges. Well, yeah, let's find out about that. Self-determination struggle by Tamils. Oh, forget that. So there's a kind of biasing going on, you know, by the passage of forms affecting not only the conduct, but also the content of the struggle. Similarly, with the Palestinian struggle, you could say that, again, issues of international law, international humanitarian law, arising out of the attacks on Gaza, and well-attested claims, and a lot of them have been backed by investigations by the UN, for example, of the inadequate discrimination and proportionality of those attacks. You may remember that Baroness Wazi resigned from the British cabinet over the refusal of David Cameron to use the word disproportionate to describe Israel's attack on Gaza, because that has a specific meaning in the context of the Fourth Geneva Convention. So that's kind of issue tends to rise to the top of the agenda. Interestingly, this Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network is now debating whether to support the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions call. APAN has the job of carrying on kind of quiet, behind-the-scenes lobbying with members of Parliament and other decision makers to draw to their attention recent developments in the conflict and how that frames the particular state at the moment of the Palestinian cause. So it has had the job of being a very kind of quiet, low-key organisation, but it now is wanting to add a presence beyond the institutional realm where it has been operating, and now an access to the symbolic domains, the communication space, as well, because it sees that as increasingly important to its effectiveness. In the process, of course, these self-determination rights and freedoms risk being diluted, occluded, marginalised, even excluded from consideration. I have occasionally daydreamed about a situation where the UN says to President Rajapakse, negotiate seriously on autonomy for the Tamils if you want to avoid spending the rest of your life in a cell in The Hague. Some people call that linkage. But whether that daydream will ever come to pass, I somehow doubt. But it could be, there's a suggestion, I think, that the kind of issues that grab attention in the communication space are not necessarily the ones which are central to the struggle. This is slightly related, I would say, to what Lara Montesinos-Coleman was saying this morning. The risk of centering our engagement with a conflict or a situation on a liberal conception of human rights may risk freezing in time or freezing a set of institutional arrangements and frameworks which actually keep the people in question in a state of subservience or oppression. So, you know, that's maybe a risk here too. One of the, I suppose the best example, the most well-known, the most well-attested evidence of breaches of international humanitarian law, still from Operation Cast Lead, nearly 6 years ago now. The UN fact-finding mission, known to you and me as the Goldstone Report, a deliberately disproportionate attack designed to punish, humiliate and terrorise the civilian population, radically diminish its local economic capacity, both to work and to provide for itself, and to force upon it an ever-increasing sense of dependency and vulnerability. And these activists from Breaking the Silence, who again operate largely in these symbolic domains, these are serving and usually former Israeli Defence Force personnel, recounting the orders they were given on entering Gaza in a part of that attack. In urban warfare, everyone is your enemy. There are no innocents. That's a straight-out refutation of the distinction drawn in that Fourth Geneva Convention between combatants and bystanders. That lifted these issues, I think, up the mainstream media agenda, certainly. There's a well-known piece of research by two researchers from the Glasgow University Media Group, Greg Philo and Mike Berry, which is called Bad News from Israel. And they started doing field work in, I think, 2001-2 with various groups of people in Britain from different walks of life, assembling them, and they were going to play that. They played them examples of coverage of the Israel-Palestine conflict from television news. But as a precursor to that, they asked them what they thought they knew about it. And quite a lot more of them believed it was the Palestinians occupying the occupied territories than realised it was the Israelis. They'd vaguely recalled hearing the words occupied or occupation, but they were never kind of fully spelt out to them. That was interesting. I mean, Greg was one of the people who gave evidence to an inquiry held by the BBC, when I still worked there, by the BBC governors, as was, into the BBC's coverage of the conflict. This was in 2006. And the report came out and it said the BBC's coverage is caught in a straitjacket of balance, and it is constrained, therefore, from conveying the essential imbalance between an occupier in charge of events and an occupied people whose lives are being controlled. And it led to various changes. So, for example, you will now still hear BBC reporters say on air, the settlements are illegal. So the settlements are seen as illegal under international law, though Israel disputes this. So that's quite a good formula for giving that little bit of background. We became, for a while, still just about, I think, more likely to see pictures of Palestinians queuing at checkpoints with the explanation that this is not a queue to go from Palestine to Israel, show your passport like you do to go from, you know, Germany to France. This is to go from one part of Palestinian territory to another. So those two kind of reforms were quite interesting, I think. It so happened that I wrote a piece enthusiastically greeting this report for the publication of the Frontline Club in London, which is a journalists' organisation. And in retaliation for that, my BBC bosses promptly took me off air. I was told that it would be extremely odd for a presenter to be seen to be siding with the report. I think, I mean, I left shortly after, but and I sprang effortlessly into an academic career, you see. But I think those reforms testify to the fact that wiser heads prevailed, and people did see the report ultimately as an opportunity to be bolstered in doing the right thing. So I thought it was quite interesting. Anyway, so that's an example of how the passage of forms to this activity in symbolic domains in and around these network legitimacy conflicts has perhaps slightly changed the subject away from the original subject. It poses a few challenges for research. This question, how do 1,000 Facebook friends stop the ice melting, is from an interesting briefing called New Times, which has been published by Neil Lawson of the Compass group, which was originally set up as a ginger group within the Labour Party, and Indra Adnan of the Soft Power Network. And they are, among many people, to wonder how online activism exerts political agency. We have a feeling that it must somehow, and occasionally there are glimpses or snippets, like the tweets that MPs reported receiving in the build-up to the vote on the intervention in Syria. But are there, as Earle et al. Wonder, fundamental differences between offline activism and internet activism? And there are quite a few people, Jennifer Earle being one of them, who have gone at least a bit further in saying, well, really, to succeed in online activism, to bring about extra movement outcomes through online activism, requires a very different set of emphases from the offline activism. So while certain messages might have been suitable for one form of activism, different messages might be suitable for this new form. The standard, I suppose, empiricist approach to social movement theory emphasizes the structure of political opportunities. What determines the success of a social movement is how it can find its own niche or its own entry point into the structure of political opportunities, and therefore exert that agency and bring about change. And there is some evidence, I think, and a lot of people have pondered this, that the migration of the public sphere into a communication space has changed the structure of political opportunities. And one example of this, I think, early in the life of the present coalition government, which is quite interesting, was the U-turn it performed over the proposed privatisation of forest management in Britain. That very rapidly an online petition of some 500,000 names was gathered, and in the words of Dominic Grieve, the then Attorney General, the fire began. He said that ignited the fire of this campaign, and national newspapers then jumped on the bandwagon. Now, of course, you know, there was a particular kind of Tory coalition at work. You can imagine the Green Wellies, the Labradors, the rolling Surrey countryside, the Daily Telegraph, the retired colonels, the first cuckoo of spring, etc., etc. So it was almost ready-made as a kind of prototypical government U-turn in the making. But nonetheless, I think that tells us something about the changed structure of political opportunities. And certainly in respect of activism by the British Tamil Congress here over the issues around the war crimes allegations left over from that part of the conflict, in many cases the Tamils have a good in with Conservative MPs. You know, visible Tamil populations, the people you meet, you go to a British Tamil Congress event, shake hands, you know, hello, how are you doing, who are you and where are you from? Oh, well, I'm a dentist from you know, some kind of West London suburb, okay, or you speak to a lady, it's very nice to meet you, madam, you know, how are you? I'm very pleased because my son's just passed his accountancy degree. You know, so these are kind of, you know, I'm not wanting to stereotype, of course, but you know, the Tamil activists are quintessential Tory voters in many ways. And they live in the kind of constituencies that tend to be represented by Tory MPs. So the Tories have to take them fairly seriously, and David Cameron has evidently had to take them fairly seriously, as I'll suggest in a moment. And therefore that has enabled them to use the traditional offline modes of activity for a social movement in lobbying MPs behind the scenes, But of course, as they well know, it takes place in a context which has been created by activity in symbolic domains, in the communication space. You know, have you seen Channel 4 News, Minister, would be the first question. Where does Channel 4 News get its images from? Why? From this self-communication, you see. So it's something is coming together here. The lower picture shows, the upper picture shows Cameron at the Chogam in Sri Lanka. Chogam, I used to cover Chogams now and again when I was a political correspondent. Always sounded to me like someone choking on something. Cause for the Heimlich manoeuvre to be deployed, you know. But indeed, Cameron was almost choking on Chogam by the time he got there. He had to face down some pretty heavy demands to follow the example of the Canadian Stephen Harper, for example, in declining to attend. But as a kind of corollary for attending, he agreed to go and see for himself conditions in the northern part of Sri Lanka and to give Mr. Rajapakse a jolly good talking to. And he sat down with Mr. Rajapakse and told him off. And at this speech here, he was saying that unless the Sri Lankan government properly investigates these serious allegations, we, the British, will use our diplomacy in support of the call at the UN Human Rights Council when it meets next March to call for a UN independent international investigation of war crimes allegations. And indeed, they did. And that's what we've got now under Judge Navi Pillai. Now, how are we doing for time? Not bad. I'll stop soon, but this, I think, there's a Castells phrase from, I think it's Communication Power, his book published a couple of years ago, that what we're seeing is a fundamental mechanism of power making in the network society, switching power. That is to say, taking impetus, ideas, momentum, political agency that is generated in one domain, in one context, at one level, and successfully switching it to other contexts, deploying it, cashing it in, wielding it, exerting it, leveraging it. Okay, so that's very important, I think. Some of the theoretical challenges, to go into them a bit more deeply, this is Bob Carr, by the way, the former Australian Foreign Minister, who was a founder in 1977 of Labour Friends of Israel. Labour Friends of Israel in Australia, and is a founder in 2014 of Labour Friends of Palestine. So he's been explaining why he's done that. When he was Foreign Minister, he said he came under heavy-duty influence from a bunch of pro-Israel groups that he called the Falafel Faction, operating out of Melbourne. And these are some of the basics of received social movement theory. That social movement theory operates with a political process model whereby the successful social movement will build a system of alliances with organizations of like mind and seek meaningful access points. And its success will depend partly on informal procedures adopted by institutions and political actors in relation to a given challenge. Now, the launch of Bob Carr's book was an informal procedure, I would suggest, after he'd ceased being Foreign Minister. It's been highly influential on political debate in Australia. And I'm suggesting that all these theoretical nostrums of social movement theory need to be revised in response to the passage of forms that I've been talking about. And that's an example of it. Methodological challenges, I'll just say briefly, I am the fortunate beneficiary of regular emails from these four people. Elaine Black has emailed me 448 times over the last year, extolling the virtues of Israel and convincing me that the Palestinians are a threat to civilization. Ali Kazak is the former Palestinian ambassador to Australia and sends out a digest of the most fantastic educational historical background material about the Palestinians. Nirmanusan Balasundaram is one of those journalists for democracy in Sri Lanka who sends out material about the ongoing encroachment into land and habitation of the Tamil people by the Sri Lankan military. And a chap called M. Gunasekara, in many ways the most interesting of the bunch, based in Melbourne. He's the only one who puts all the email addresses in the copy line and none in the blind copy line. And there's about 330 of the buggers. So if I wanted to, I could do a reply all, and I too could reach people like the Speaker of the upper house of the Canadian Parliament and people like this. He's fair play to him. He's done a lot of digging to get all these email addresses. How many go straight to trash, I don't really know. But anyway, these are my 4 unwitting correspondents. I've never done anything to cause any of these to come in. But one method that is therefore fairly close to hand is to carry out a content analysis of the data streams represented by these 4 supplies of regular emails to find support or indeed refutation of my thesis about the influence on the content of the conflict of these changes in the conduct of the conflict. And the last one is the difficult business of gauging the influence of digital media. As a media researcher, I can make a fairly intelligent set of comments about the position of mainstream media as a social artifact of political discourse. And therefore I can retrieve the content of newspapers or the manifest content of newspapers about a particular subject in a particular time frame, and from that I can say various things about how political discourse was developing over time. It's very much more difficult to close your fist over a meaningful sample or bunch of digital media or social media activity. One person who's gone some way towards it is this chap Axel Bruns, who takes Twitter feed data as a measure of media influence, on the grounds that if you have a URL of something, whether it be a picture, an article, whatever it be, if you retweet it to your contacts, then it must have influenced you in some way. Then there's analysis of hyperlinks to try to develop an idea of what is called the politics of association for and in the specific milieu of what Mark Duffield called the electronic atmosphere, the digital atmosphere, I might say, as a milieu for exertion of political agency. And then there's, again, content analysis opportunities in this very interesting idea floated by Paul Mason, the Channel 4 News correspondent, when he was in Gaza, that we're seeing a fracturing of mediascapes which could be characterized as, on the one hand, the green, and on the other hand, the blue. The blue being, the Israeli flag, and the official communiques put out by US supporting governments, such as that of the United Kingdom. The green being the Palestinians and the various kind of solidarity groups around the world, including some of the ones we work with in Australia. So anyway, there's a world of challenges, of course, for the researcher, as ever, and I am only in the very opening stages of addressing them. I'd be interested in your comments and feedback, and so for the moment, thank you, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Jake. If you'd like to grab a seat, we now have just over 20 minutes for questions, and already I have a hand at the back, so if you'd like to start us off.
Yeah. Hello, I'm Karthik, I'm from the University of Essex. Thank you very much, Jake, for your presentation. It was really great. But I have some problems with some parts of it. For instance, the image which was your choice from Channel 4. I don't think it's exactly the right image to give as an example for telecommunications, because the image was taken by a Sinhala soldier, it was received by a Sinhala journalist, and passed on to a British channel. I don't think there's any self-communication or a process of self-representation over here. It only took on value as a symbol of interpretation and several interpretations. Likewise, the discourse which was generated around these images and videos that were sent to Channel 4 and other human rights organizations were just confined to the question of human rights. Very rarely did they take the question of political rights, and this has been contested by news media of Tamils, like Tamilnet, which I would say is autoethnographic, who have actually accused these outlets for not recognizing the political rights of the Tamils. And likewise, this discourse of war crimes which has been created and which you say the Tamil organizations are lifting up, completely true. There are some Tamil organizations who have been since 2009 accusing the Sri Lankan government of war crimes. All the same, there has also been a very strong internal pressure from within the Tamil community to say, which actually says that the mere accusation of war crimes would also mean that we are not recognizing the sovereignty which the entity earned, and therefore you should make the accusation of genocide on the Sri Lankan government and call for a referendum. This was also the nature of the tribunal in Bremen early this year. Likewise, even Nirmala Sundar, whom you cited, who incidentally happens to be a very good friend of mine, made a presentation in the American Psychological Association a few months back that the nature of the Sri Lankan occupation in the Tamil areas is genocidal. So now, when there are these sort of narratives which are competing and which are gaining momentum, do you think that just a mere strategy of calling Rajapakse a war criminal or using mainstream media spaces alone would be effective, or Tamils have to broaden their horizons and expand their alliances?
Jake.
Well, I mean, the second point you make, I take in support of the point I was making. The point I'm making is I think there is a danger of aspects of a conflict which are capable of attracting the most attention in symbolic domains, in a sense distracting from the substantive issues that people started with. And therefore, yes, you know, I mean, I attended a conference organised by the British Tamil Congress in the UK Parliament at the beginning of this year. And what they were trying to do was to draw people's attention to the ongoing issue of encroachment on and theft of their land, Tamil people's land, by the Sri Lankan state and in particular the Sri Lankan military, which I thought in a sense is a way of linking these ideas, because it keeps the idea that this should be seen as the land of the Tamil people, you know, which is a very important component part of that struggle, while at the same time feeding into what's already established as an agenda of interest to many media, people in many different symbolic domains, about the conduct of war by the Sri Lankan authorities. But I think I agree with you. I think it's probably a problem. What I was suggesting about the image taken by the Sinhala soldier, or the Sri Lankan government soldier, was that that's an example of what my former BBC colleague Nick Gowing calls information doers. And the way he puts it is that, you know, I think he even draws attention to this phrase that was bandied about by people who I think probably should have known better, that it was a war without witnesses. Well, there were witnesses. It was just a case of collecting the witness material and aggregating it and contextualizing it in such a way as to have it properly appreciated. And that, I think, does entail probably collaboration with mainstream media. This is what Castells is talking about, switching power. And I mentioned WikiLeaks, for example. You know, WikiLeaks is a good example of what has been called the democratic affordances of digital media. That is to say, it devised its own secure platform where people could place whistleblower testimony about abuses and therefore get it into the public domain without reprisals. So that's a very important enabling technology, but in order to gain due prominence and salience for the very important disclosures in that huge motherlode of material, the diplomatic cables, it had to enter into partnership with established newspapers. The Guardian here, the New York Times, the Sydney Morning Herald, and so on and so forth. And that's an example of what I call crossover, or what Castells calls switching power. And what it means is that attention in the context of these conflicts will be drawn to the aspects which best fit with the established practices and priorities and news values of those organisations, for better or worse.
Excellent, thank you, Jake.
Matthew Jackson, not quite a retired colonel. Ukraine. I wondered very quickly, bearing in mind the time, whether you had a view on how legitimate media can counter lies in this space. If you look particularly at Ukraine, for example, the disinformation that came out after the shooting down of the Malaysian airline, you know, the direct lies that were published, probably through Russian media outlets, were picked up by Western media and effectively said, you know, there are rumours circulating that. You know, unsubstantiated, no evidence of any accuracy, yet still recirculated. So compounding the message that was trying to be put out there by the Russian leadership. And I want to get a view on what actions legitimate media might be able to take in this space.
Do you want to do that?
Well, let's have Gregor, and then if you can respond.
Sure, yeah.
My question, Jay, was just a bit wider than that, about the very idea of legitimacy. So what's interesting is not only conduct, but content, but there's also something deeper going on in terms of presuppositions of appeal to legitimacy.
Yeah.
Because in more kind of national, self-contained, last 200 years democratic containers, there's a kind of implicit notion of a stable body of fellow citizens that one is appealing to for the legitimacy of one's particular cause. But there's something going on here that seems to me to require either the abandonment of normal notions of legitimacy or some kind of deeper transformation. And I just wanted to put it on that.
Thank you for the questions, both. In answer to the first one, journalists' job is to report the facts. And I was sometimes told that by man to just report the facts, Lynch, when I sort of branched into speculation, you know. Journalism has the important job of distinguishing facts from claims. And there are some cases where claims have acquired the misleading patina of facticity through repetition in the media. Saddam's weapons of mass destruction, for example. There are equally serious cases where what we should regard as facts are being downgraded to claims as if their iteration requires an equal chance for the other side of the story. Human-induced climate change, the illegality of Israel's military occupation of Palestinian territory. So, therefore, it's beholden on us to have an idea of what we mean by facts. Of course, what we mean by facts in this critical social science context, you have a hard time in kind of trying to stick up for a correspondence theory of representation. And in a sense, one can have a social constructionist view of facts. Quite easy in the case of the climate change one. You know, we've all paid our taxes to put that intergovernmental panel on climate change in place to give us a starting point in that debate. We can't afford to have people coming along representing hidden oil interests and wanting us to go back to square one. We've got to start somewhere. We'll start there, thank you very much. And we recognise that fact because it's attested by the colossal preponderance of qualified opinion. Now, on the Ukraine, yes, there are lots of, there's first of all people who are playing into the inclination of journalists to hear both sides. So there's one side of the story, there must be another and equal opposite sides of the story. But here's what I find curious. You correct me if I'm wrong. There's an investigation being ordered into an act of mass murder, and it's being conducted by 4 governments. One of those governments is the government of Ukraine. And all 4 governments have agreed that no information about that investigation will be released publicly without the agreement of all 4 of those governments. Now, to my mind, knowing what I do and having a reasonable idea of what I don't, I would regard the government of Ukraine as one of the suspects. So how usual is it for a murder investigation to give the role of one of the suspects of being effectively in a position of having a veto over the release of information about the investigation? Something extremely fishy is going on there, and I personally have formed what I admit is only a vague impression that that story is almost certainly more closed and more controlled than any other I can remember for a very long time. You know, there's a lot of substantive material to come out there. So, on the second point, I think I've indicated probably which way I'll jump on that. Yes, there are competing claims to legitimacy. M. Gunasekara, for example, I didn't necessarily have time to go into this, is very concerned that the UN investigation and the track record of Navi Pillai in particular position her as the agent of Western interference with the sovereign rights of a post-colonial country. That's a very strong appeal to legitimacy. In fact, when the Sri Lankans first finished off the Tamil Tigers, there was a motion congratulating them that was adopted by the UN Human Rights Council, and it was proposed by Cuba. And Cuba is in many ways the convener of the G77, which is the developing countries in the World Trade Talks. So yes, it has strong credentials to draw upon and a strong account of legitimacy to tell. And that has already proved influential, and I'm sure will continue to prove influential as a rival and alternative sort of legitimacy.
Hello, my name is Saleh University. I had a question since half of your research is going to be sense influence how this media have been see how the social media influence national politics, the presence of diaspora movement. You took an example of the Tamils, and it's sometimes, like in Sweden, for instance, it's often remarked that there's a relatively large Palestinian diaspora which influenced Swedish politics towards Israel, toward Israel and Palestine. And I wonder if there's any how that diaspora movement influences the interlink between this international hyperlinking and national politics.
Yeah, I think.
Can we just take a second question, James? Sorry.
Sure.
Emmanuel, do you want to?
Okay. My question is that, from your presentation, do you want to agree that, what do you think about the media playing a role of celebrating and contributing to the growth of insurgency and crisis in the world by their manner of reportage of those incidents? Let me give, for instance, if a terrorist group bombs a car, it becomes a front page headline in CNN, BBC, Sky News. But when the military records a breakthrough in that form of operation, it's not a headline. Are we, what role is media playing in this kind of situation?
There we are, Jake, 2 questions for you.
The first one about the role of diasporas. Yeah, that's probably a missing portion of my explanation. Sorry. What I think the Tamils and the Palestinians, for fairly obvious reasons, look to international solidarity as a means of extending their political agency because of the very straitened circumstances in which they find themselves in their own territory, and therefore the links they have with diaspora communities are a very important part of that. And in order to gain traction for their cause in the UK, in Australia, in Sweden, lots of other places, it's a fairly natural choice to pick up on those issues of legitimacy, such as issues concerning international humanitarian law, because they're not merely the concern of the Tamils and the Palestinians, they should be the concern of everyone. So that's another factor which I think is leading to the foregrounding of those components of the conflict in these symbolic domains. The second one about the media. Media produce a narrative of events for reasons arising out of the organizational characteristics of the media. Now, the conduct and content of journalism is changing as well. Now the mediascape is much more seamless than it was. There are fewer obvious starting points. We used to take the starting point as the interview just after 8 a.m. on the Today programme. One way to conceive of terrorists is as event promoters, and to conceive of terrorism, therefore, as a response to the kind of ongoing syntagmatic domination of the communication space by certain interests, perspectives, versions of events, and so on. And it's the aim of disrupting that flow, which is essentially the aim of the terrorist. And so therefore it is indissociable from the organizational characteristics of the media, and it's a phenomenon which has developed in parallel with it. There's no way around that.
Excellent, thank you. Well, we've come to almost to the end of our conference today. I hope you'll join me in thanking Jake.